Chapter 1: Slavery, Pride, and the American Experiment. The system that would eventually tear the United States apart was not built with gunpowder and cannon fire. It was built quietly, year after year, ledger by ledger, field by field, birth by birth. Long before soldiers ever stood in formation, the American economy had already chosen sides. In the North, wealth rose with smoke and speed. In the South, it rose with cotton and chains. Both societies called themselves American, but they were building entirely different worlds on the same soil. Slavery was not a peripheral institution. It was the engine room of the Southern economy. By the mid-19th century, cotton alone supplied the majority of the world's textile industry. British mills ran on Southern fibers. Northern shipbuilders, insurers, and bankers fed off Southern exports. Wall Street itself pulsed to the rhythm of slave-grown crops. The sin was not limited to plantations. It crept northward through contracts, cargo holds, and steel vaults. Even as some Northern voices condemned slavery, Northern fortunes were built upon it. This contradiction, moral rejection, and financial dependence, became the quiet poison of American hypocrisy. In the Southern states, slavery shaped not just labor, but psychology. A culture grew around it, deep and invisible as roots beneath soil. Honor was everything. Reputation was survival. A man's value was measured in land, bloodline, and dominance. Violence was not chaotic. It was ritualized. Dueling grounds absorbed grudges like sacred earth. Insults demanded blood. Weakness invited destruction. This was not merely about race. It was about hierarchy. The belief that some men were born to command and others to serve. Over time, slavery grew into more than labor. It became identity. Southern preachers wrapped it in scripture. Politicians dressed it in law. Intellectuals encased it in theories of racial destiny. To question slavery was no longer just to criticize an economy, but to attack a way of life. To threaten its existence felt like cultural extinction. Meanwhile, the North was becoming something unrecognizable by comparison. Mills rose where forests once stood. Cities swelled with foreign languages and factory smoke. Immigrants arrived by the hundreds of thousands, desperate for work and shelter. They slept 10 to a room and labored 14 hours a day in places that chewed men into machinery. Children worked in darkness. Women endured hands they could not refuse. Progress did not come gently. It arrived with teeth. But to Northerners, this was the future. If life was brutal, at least it was fluid. A man could rise. A family could move. Suffering was not permanent, only transitional. The North believed itself forward-looking. It saw opportunity where the South saw decay. It mistook speed for virtue and freedom for justice. Between these two worlds stood Washington, a capital built on compromise and fear. Every victory for one side was measured in loss for the other. Politicians crafted agreements like tourniquets, tight enough to stop the bleeding, not enough to heal the wound. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850. Each one postponed reckoning while deepening resentment. Every temporary solution became permanent anger. The Constitution itself had been a pact with contradiction. It spoke of liberty while protecting bondage. It praised equality while counting slaves as fractions of men. At its birth, the nation had swallowed a moral poison with the belief that time would neutralize it. Instead, the poison spread. As America expanded westward, the wound reopened with every mile. New territories raised the same question again and again, like a chant. Free or slave, and no one asked it out of innocence. This was power, counted in senators and electoral votes. Each new state became a strategic weapon. The map itself turned into a battlefield. Bleeding Kansas revealed what compromise had hidden. Ballots became bullets. Polling stations became war zones. Men crossed borders just to vote, then to kill. Families vanished into prairie fires, bodies floated into rivers. Civilization slipped away quietly at first, then all at once. The country had crossed a threshold. Law had failed. Order was slipping. And beneath every argument lay one truth no law could erase. Slavery was evil, and everyone knew it. They argued about economics. They argued about sovereignty. They argued about states' rights. But those were disguises. Beneath every speech stood a million chained ghosts. The Southerner feared annihilation, not metaphorically, but literally. To dismantle slavery was to annihilate wealth, caste, and security. The planter class believed that abolition meant social collapse, that freed slaves would rise up, that society would drown in revenge. And so fear hardened into ideology. The Northerner feared moral decay. A nation founded on liberty was quietly rotting at its heart. How long, they wondered, before the poison reached them fully? Could a republic survive when it called bondage legal? Could it claim heaven while smelling of hell? These fears did not remain abstract. They seeped into politics. Law books became battle plans. Newspapers became weapons. Sermons sharpened into sermons of war. Then came voices that could no longer be hushed. Frederick Douglass spoke like thunder. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a book that bled into a nation's conscience. Abolitionists burned effigies and were burned in return. The quiet compromise of the founding generation collapsed under the cries of a new one. In the South, speeches grew angrier. In the North, pulpits grew bolder. In between stood millions who wanted peace, but mistook silence for safety. Slavery had not just enslaved a people. It had enslaved the nation. Every attempt to preserve the Union without uprooting bondage was an illusion. You could not build a house on rot and call it permanent. By the late 1850s, Americans no longer discussed whether the nation would fracture. But when? Families were divided by geography and belief. Brothers debated war over supper. Children learned to hate in classrooms. The idea of compromise no longer soothed anyone. It enraged both sides equally. Then a man walked into a federal armory one night and tried to drag the nation into fire by force. John Brown failed in body, but succeeded in spirit. He terrified the South. He electrified the North. He transformed argument into terror. His death was a prophecy. The nation watched him die and did not look away. From that moment on, the silence ended. America had carried slavery like a dormant blade under its skin. Now it had pierced bone. Political parties splintered. Men spoke openly of war. Military drills became community events. The language of blood entered everyday language. Fallen empires were suddenly not so foreign. Americans began to realize that history was not something that happened elsewhere. It was happening here. And underneath it all moved a single certainty, unspoken and unavoidable. This was no longer about compromise. It was about survival. In cities and plantations, in churches and factories, Americans felt the shift. The future had become sharp. The air tasted like metal. The age of words was ending. The fuse had been lit, and no one could reach it now. Chapter 2. A Nation on Edge. The fuse that had been lit now burned visibly, No longer hidden in speeches or buried in law books, the coming catastrophe began to spill into the open. The nation did not explode all at once. It cracked, it frayed, it unraveled thread by thread. The land itself became a battlefield long before the soldiers did. Kansas and Nebraska, names etched into the American map with optimism, were transformed into testing grounds for hatred. When Congress passed a law that allowed settlers to vote on whether slavery would exist in their new homes, it did not give democracy a voice. It gave violence permission. Men poured into Kansas not to plant crops, but to build armies. Some came from Missouri, armed and bitter, determined to carve slave territory into the prairie. Others arrived from New England carrying rifles baptized, Beecher's Bibles, and sermons heavy with righteousness. Voting turned into terror. Ballot boxes were seized. Homes were torched. Bodies were buried in shallow graves. Kansas did not decide its future. It bled into it. The newspapers soon named it what it was, Bleeding Kansas. But the truth was worse. The whole nation was bleeding there. This was not a border conflict. It was a diagnosis. While Kansas burned, Washington rotted. The United States Congress, once imagined as a temple of reason, began to resemble a tavern filled with powder and whiskey. Words turned into insults, insults into threats, threats into blows. The nation watched as its lawmakers shouted, cursed, and scuffled like enemies rather than colleagues. It felt like a bad omen given flesh. When a Southern congressman struck an abolitionist senator nearly to death on the Senate floor, the message was unmistakable. Law no longer protected the nation. The nation had turned on law. Outside the chamber, the damage spread inward into homes and hearts. Families stopped speaking freely. Brothers watched their words around sisters. Sons learned how dangerous opinions could be. Preachers tested each sermon like dry tinder. Dinner tables became minefields. Guests chose silence or war. Americans were doing something new. They were beginning to fear one another. In the North, horror grew slowly or into obsession. Pamphlets were printed, meetings were held, poems read by candlelight whispered of rebellion and redemption. In the South, dread hardened into fury. Every abolitionist became an invader, every sermon a threat, every northern newspaper an insult. Southern towns built militias not to fight enemies abroad, but neighbors inland. Then John Brown emerged from the gathering dark, like a biblical vision no one had ordered. He was old, bearded, silent when he wasn't furious. He did not need audience approval. He needed obedience, only from God. In Kansas, he did not campaign. He executed. 5 men were dragged from their homes and slaughtered in the night. They were not soldiers. They were not even commanders. They were symbols. To Brown, murder was no longer a crime. It was purification. He believed slavery would fall only if blood baptized the soil. He believed he had been chosen to draw the knife. When he marched into Harper's Ferry with a handful of men and tried to ignite a slave rebellion by seizing the federal armory, the nation did not witness a failed insurrection. It witnessed a prophecy. Brown failed tactically, but spiritually, he succeeded. Southerners did not say a fanatic. They saw the future. To them, Brown did not represent abolition. He was abolition, a living executioner sent north by a godless civilization to butcher them in their sleep. Northern reactions split the soul of the country cleanly in two. Some mourned him as a martyr. Church bells rang for a murdered zealot. Poets praised his courage. Others called him insane. Either way, he burrowed into the American psyche deeper than any law ever had. Fear crossed a line. The United States ceased seeing itself as troubled. It began to see itself as hunted. In this decade, Politics did not merely fail, it imploded. Political parties disintegrated like brittle bone. Old alliances shattered under the weight of a single question. Would the future belong to freedom or bondage? The familiar architecture of compromise collapsed. A new party rose from the wreckage, built not on tradition, but on rejection. It did not form to govern. It formed to oppose. Its enemy was slavery, and slavery recognized the threat instantly. The traditional system had depended on flexibility, the ability to bargain, shift, delay. But something had changed now. There was no more delay left. America had reached the end of postponement. What came next would not be negotiated. It would be endured. The approaching election vibrated beneath the country, like the distant roll of thunder. Everyone sensed its arrival. Everyone feared its outcome. It was no longer a choice between candidates. It was a judgment between futures. Southerners spoke openly of leaving if the wrong man won. Northerners spoke of salvation if the right one did. The language of elections gave way to the language of rebellion. Flags began appearing in town squares that did not yet belong to any nation. Children asked questions their parents could not answer. Would there be war? Would they have to fight? No one spoke easily anymore. No one slept deeply. The nation had not fired a single cannon, but it already lived like it had. In boarding houses and plantation halls, in river towns and city alleys, Americans began to carry themselves differently. There was caution in ordinary conversation. Familiar streets felt altered. Friendships became conditional. Loyalty became louder than truth. The people of the same country began to look at each other as if they were already enemies. The old American confidence, that invisible armor worn since independence, started to crack. That assurance that this nation was immune to the fever of Europe, the madness of empires, the suicide of republics. It was gone. The country was aging rapidly now. From optimism into suspicion, from pride into dread, from brotherhood into resentment. America was not merely preparing for war, it was practicing for it emotionally. Each new headline chipped away at stability. Each rumor sowed panic. Each skirmish felt like rehearsal. The idea of unity no longer felt heroic. It felt naive. Then the election arrived, and everything people feared came with it. The man who emerged victorious did not promise revolution, but he represented it, not by his words, by his existence. And with that, the last thread snapped silently. The nation had spent decades delaying the future. Now it had been forced to meet it face to face. And it was no longer listening, only sharpening. Chapter 3. Election of Lincoln. The country walked toward the election as if toward a verdict it was not ready to hear. Every wound inflicted in the previous decade pulsed beneath the surface now, raw and unanswered. Words had failed, laws had failed, compromises lay in ruins. The only thing left was choice, and America chose through a ballot. Abraham Lincoln did not arrive like a conqueror. He did not carry promise in his smile or thunder in his voice. He was awkward, solemn, unmistakably human. His hands were large and rough, as if carved by labor rather than politics. His face bore the permanent mark of thought, deep lines shaped by doubt more than ambition. There was nothing about him that suggested destiny, nothing that foreshadowed apocalypse. And yet for half the nation, he embodied it. Lincoln had risen quietly until he had not risen at all. He had been thrust upward by the sheer force of division. He was not born wealthy. He had no dynasty behind his name. His power came from words and restraint. from an ability to speak plainly in an era drunk on outrage. He had spent years arguing that slavery was wrong, but not loudly. He believed in union first, morality second, not because he lacked conviction, but because he believed a divided nation could not save itself. The South did not care. To them, Lincoln did not represent policy. He represented annihilation. He was the promised enemy in flesh and bone. Every sermon they had heard told them the North would destroy them. Every newspaper warned that abolition would not arrive politely, that it would come as an army, that it would not bring reform, but revenge. To Southern ears, Lincoln's calm was not reassuring. It was terrifying. In public, many Southerners claimed they wanted nothing more than peace. But in private, the language changed. The future was spoken of in final terms. There was no if anymore, only when. When they left, when the war began, when the world burned. In the North, hope broke open in quiet ways. Men did not cheer wildly. They exhaled. They believed that perhaps this plain man, this strange, sorrowful lawyer from Illinois, could hold the nation together with nothing but words and will. Churches filled with prayer, homes lit candles not for celebration, but for fear. America was no longer dreaming. It was bracing. As the votes were counted, the reality came into focus like a slow bruise. Lincoln had won in a landslide across the North without winning a single Southern state. The verdict could not have been clearer. This country was two countries, and now one of them had lost. The morning after the election did not bring riots. It brought letters. Politicians packed their desks in silence. Governors met behind closed doors. State legislatures drafted declarations instead of debating them. In train stations and along dusty roads, men began traveling home with news carried in their faces. South Carolina moved first. It did not hesitate. Within weeks, it declared itself nothing less than a foreign nation. Its flag fell from poles as if in mourning. Its new banner rose like a promise of blood. Other states watched. Then they followed. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. The Union unraveled with terrifying speed. The secession conventions did not feel chaotic. They felt ceremonial, like funerals for a nation that wasn't dead yet, but soon would be. Speeches rang in halls heavy with righteous anger. Delegates spoke of liberty while defending bondage. They quoted the Founding Fathers as if summoning ghosts to witness betrayal. Each word passed was not rhetoric. It was gravity. And gravity pulled them away from their country. There was no single moment when the United States officially died. There was no one ceremony, no one grave. There was only a series of farewells disguised as legal documents. And no one walked back. In Washington, Lincoln watched the lightning from a distance. He had not yet entered office. His power was theoretical. His burden was already crushing. He received letters that oozed threat, contempt, grief, and prophecy in equal measure. Men promised violence. Others begged him to bend. Many told him war was inevitable, regardless of what he did. He did not know yet what history would name him. He only knew that history was already standing in his doorway. The outgoing president did nothing. The nation was burning, and its leader was silent. Military arsenals across the South were seized quietly in the night. Federal forts were surrounded, not stormed. Southern officers resigned their commissions with trembling hands and hollow eyes, and went home to build the army that would soon try to destroy the one they had served. Men drilled in town squares under borrowed flags. Blacksmiths forged weapons instead of horseshoes. Tailors sewed militia uniforms like shrouds. The South was no longer preparing to leave. It was preparing to fight. And the North did not understand. No speeches were interrupted. No generals paraded through the streets. Factories continued to roar. The trains ran. The Union slept. It slept because it believed the Constitution was stronger than rage. It slept because it believed the South was bluffing. It slept because it had not yet seen what desperation looks like when it believes it is righteous. In February of 1861, as the final states of the Deep South joined the revolt, delegates met to form something new from the corpse of something old. They drafted a constitution that looked uncannily familiar, except where it did not. They protected slavery explicitly. They embraced the future by clinging to the past. They named their newborn nation the Confederacy of Slave States. And they elected a president whose fate was already sealed. Jefferson Davis was dignified, fragile, tragic. A man born for another century, asked to command a future soaked in blood. He did not seek the presidency. It sought him. Now the lines were drawn. There would be no more apologies, no more speeches, no more paper shields. The country had chosen. The election was over. The war had begun. Only no one had fired a shot yet. And when the first one finally came, it would sound like a coffin closing. Because the ticking clock had reached its final second. Chapter 4. The Break That Couldn't Be Repaired. The country did not shatter all at once. It splintered, the way old glass does, silently at first, then suddenly everywhere. What had been unimaginable only months earlier now unfolded with a terrible kind of calm. There were no riots in the streets when the first state walked away from the Union, no panic in the marketplaces, no rush of blood in the capitals. Only quiet signatures, soft-spoken speeches, polite farewells spoken with clenched teeth. South Carolina did not hesitate. It had been waiting. The state was small in miles, but ancient in rebellion. Its leaders had studied the Constitution like a contract waiting to be broken. For decades, they had warned that if the federal government ever threatened slavery, South Carolina would leave. Not protest, not argue, simply exit. No drama, no compromise, just departure. They announced their decision in December of 1860, not in fury, but in ceremony. Their declaration was written like a sermon at a funeral. Calm, certain, final. They framed secession not as rebellion, but as recovery. A return to freedom, they claimed. A rescue of themselves from a government that had supposedly turned tyrant overnight. In Charleston, the bells did not ring in mourning. They rang in celebration. Flags fell. New banners rose. Gentlemen shook hands as if they had completed an honorable business transaction. Newspapers declared independence with gleaming headlines. Churches prayed for righteousness, not restraint. Women stitched fresh emblems into fabric, while men drilled quietly under unfamiliar colors. To outsiders, it may have looked like courage. In truth, it was fear wearing its finest clothes. And fear is contagious. Mississippi followed with trembling certainty. Then Florida, then Alabama, then Georgia and Louisiana. Each departure fed the next like a torch passed in the dark. Panic disguised as confidence. Resolve built on dread. The idea that leaving first was bravery became infectious. Better to burn your house yourself, they told one another, than have someone else light the match. Texas did not wait. It had never entirely trusted Washington to begin with. Within weeks, the Deep South had removed itself from the nation like a tumor convinced it was the patient. They believed they were preserving their way of life. In reality, they were embalming it. Each state imagined itself in heroic isolation, a proud defiance against outside aggression. But none of them would survive alone. They did not leave the Union out of confidence. They left because they were terrified of it. Terrified of what a world without chains would look like. Terrified of what the North would do with power. Terrified of their own past catching up with them. Terrified that everything they owned, houses, land, wealth, memory, was built on a foundation that could not survive sunlight. So they ran, and they called it freedom. Meetings were held in candlelit rooms across the South, where men spoke of destiny and defense while refusing to speak honestly about what they were defending. They insisted the issue was sovereignty, not slavery, states' rights, not human bondage. But no constitution was revised to protect tariffs. No blood would soon be shed over railroad law. Every word rotated around a single shadow. Enslaved people would not be named. They were too central. So instead, they were hidden behind words like tradition, economy, honor, and heritage. And one word above all others, property. The moment that property was threatened, loyalty ended. The United States ceased to exist as a moral object and became a hostile power. In Washington, the atmosphere turned unreal. Officials arrived at their offices not knowing whether they would still belong to a country by nightfall. Southerners in federal posts quietly resigned and went home, to a nation that did not yet exist. Maps were redrawn with shaking hands. Letters were burned. Files disappeared. The nation dismantled itself in silence. Far from Charleston and Montgomery, ordinary people watched the news and tried to understand what rebellion looked like when it didn't have drums. They expected chaos. Instead, they saw procedure. They expected violence. Instead, they found lawyers and resolutions. And this was somehow worse, because it meant the break had been planned. There were smiles in the South that winter, but they did not reach the eyes. Men toasted a new dawn while staring as if they had glimpsed a storm cloud that refused to move. Every celebration carried a tremor. Every speech echoed with something unsaid. The Confederacy was born not in thunder, but in denial. In February of 1861, delegates gathered in Montgomery, Alabama. They called themselves builders of a nation, though none had built anything before but plantations and political deals. They brought dusty dreams of independence and polished grievances of betrayal. They wrote a constitution not as a blueprint for the future, but as a shrine to the past. They did not risk ambiguity. Slavery was no longer hidden. It was engraved. Where the old Constitution had been evasive, the new one was explicit. This nation knew what it was and what it existed to protect. And that honesty, terrible in its clarity, was the Confederacy's true birth announcement. Jefferson Davis was chosen to lead. It was not triumph that greeted him. It was burden. Davis did not wear the presidency like a crown. He wore it like a cross. He was visibly ill, even as he accepted office, thin and weary before the first shot had even been fired. There was something fragile about the Confederacy's first president, a sense that he knew the truth but was unwilling to say it aloud. No nation born in defense of slavery would live long. He did not need prophets. He could read history, and history did not smile on men who tried to freeze time. The Confederate government assembled itself hastily, like a family fleeing from a burning house while pretending they were moving voluntarily. They drafted laws, raised troops, ordered cannons. But beneath the appearance of order, there was dread. Every man in every new uniform suspected the same thing. They were stepping into a fire they did not control. Yet pride sealed every mouth shut. To admit doubt was to admit betrayal. So every man spoke bravery, even as he shakenly packed for war. And always, the laughter was loudest before departure. Across the Mason-Dixon line, the North watched with stunned disbelief. Many refused to believe the South meant it. They imagined reconciliation just beyond the horizon. A compromise still possible. A summit still forthcoming. After all, Americans did not abandon their country. Not truly. Not like this. But this time, they did. And every farewell letter from the South read like a will. When the Confederacy issued its first call for arms, it did not echo like a battle cry. It sounded like a last breath. The men who marched to drill halls and mustering fields did not imagine empire or conquest. They imagined defense. Fathers thought of daughters. Sons thought of farms. Husbands thought of hands they might not hold again. And with each step they took toward enlistment, the distance between North and South grew not in miles, but in graves. The birth of the Confederacy was not a declaration of power. It was a declaration of fear. A fear so great it refused the future. And when fear leads a nation, war follows, not proudly, but inevitably. Chapter 5. The First Shot. By the time the Confederacy called itself a nation, it had already surrounded its first battlefield. It did not look like a battlefield. No smoke rose, no blood stained the ground, no armies marched in formation. Fort Sumter sat quietly in Charleston Harbor, a half-finished shell of brick and stone surrounded by calm, reflective water. It looked peaceful. It felt anything but. Inside the fort, Major Robert Anderson lived with 85 men and a growing awareness that history had chosen them unfairly. Anderson did not want a war. He had no appetite for symbolic death. He had chosen Sumter not to provoke the South, but to protect his men from it. He had quietly abandoned Fort Moultrie weeks earlier, slipping through the dark with his garrison and relocating to Sumter's thicker walls like a man moving into a storm cellar just before the wind begins to howl. To the Confederacy, this was not defense. It was insult. The fort stood like a ghost of federal authority in the middle of a harbor that now claimed to belong to another nation. Every Southern cannon seemed to stare at it. Every tide that brushed its walls whispered a question. Why are you still here? In Montgomery, the Confederate leadership weighed options with clenched jaws and rehearsed speeches. No nation could be born with a foreign fortress in its mouth. Sumter was not strategically vital, but it was psychologically unbearable. A country cannot feel legitimate while another country occupies its harbor. And legitimacy was the Confederacy's greatest weakness. Without violence, without blood, it was only paper and speeches. Without a battle, it was nothing but ink and nerve. They did not want to fire the first shot, but they felt like they had to. In Washington, another man wrestled with the same nightmare from the opposite side. Abraham Lincoln entered the presidency not riding a wave, but stepping into a hurricane. He had inherited a dismembered nation and an army that did not yet exist. He had no plan forged in secret, no script prepared for such a moment, only dread. He was reminded daily that any decision he made could rip the country further apart. Do nothing, and the Union appears weak. Do something, and he becomes the butcher of America. Letters flooded his office. Some warned of disaster, some begged for compromise, some demanded force. All of them wanted him to act. But every possible action ended in blood. Sumter was slowly starving, Supplies within its walls dwindled like hope. Bread became thin, patience thinner. The men slept in their uniforms because they knew the night would not remain quiet forever. Lincoln faced an impossible choice: resupply the fort and be accused of invasion, withdraw and admit defeat without a fight, relieve hunger and start war, feed peace and lose the country. He chose the hunger, almost. He drafted a letter not with threats, but with restraint. He announced that ships would sail not with guns, but with food. No troops, no weapons, only bread. If the Confederacy fired on supply ships, the world would know who struck first. He did not announce aggression. He announced morality. But morality is a terrible shield against cannons. When news reached Charleston that supplies were coming, the harbor began to thrum with unease. The Confederate South did not see bread. It saw a wedge. If they allowed the shipment to land, they admitted the Union still held power. If they fired, they lit the war. They chose the fire. The standoff stretched thin as wire. Negotiators crossed water under flags of truce, each carrying messages that would change nothing. Offers were made, deadlines passed. Flags were raised and lowered, as if unsure which they belonged to. Robert Anderson was offered safe passage if he would surrender the fort. He refused, quietly, honorably, and foolishly, or heroically. No one knew which yet. Before dawn on April the 12th, 1861, Charleston slept, or pretended to. In homes along the shore, men and women heard distant boots and the scrape of artillery. They woke not to alarm, but to anticipation. Some dressed and climbed rooftops. Others walked down to the water like processioners heading to a baptism. No one knew what would happen, only that something would. At 4:30 in the morning, the sky cracked. A cannon bloomed into flame. Then another. Then dozens. Thunder shattered the harbor. Shells arced through darkness like hellish stars, slamming into Fort Sumter with a roar that tore sleep from the city's bones. The fort answered, not with fury, but with endurance. Its guns fired slower, weaker. The men fired not in anger, but in desperation. Brick chipped away under cannon blows. Smoke thickened the air. The harbor vanished behind black curtains. Water rippled with falling iron. Birds screamed. Inside the fort, Anderson's men did not scream. They steadied themselves. They fired when they could. They ran when they had to. They prayed when they were out of options. The firing lasted 34 hours. 34 hours where the United States died and rebirthed itself as something unrecognizable. Miraculously, no one had been killed during the bombardment. But that did not make it gentle. It made it ominous. When Anderson finally surrendered, he did not crawl. He marched. His men stood straight as they could beneath falling ash, saluted their flag, and marched out as defeated Federal soldiers, leaving what was now a foreign fortress. They did not vanish. They became legend. In Charleston, bells rang. Champagne flowed. Women waved handkerchiefs from balconies. Men embraced in uniform. The South had fired, and it had been answered with surrender. For one moment, the Confederacy tasted victory. But it was not victory. It was ignition. When the news reached the North, it hit like cold water across the face of a man dreaming of peace. Soldiers who had never imagined themselves fighting suddenly packed bags. Factories halted. Flags unfurled. The hesitation ended. The war had been chosen. Lincoln did not weep. He spoke quietly. He called for volunteers, and the nation answered, not with speeches, with marching feet. The cannons that thundered over Charleston Harbor had not merely struck a fort. They had struck an idea that Americans could disagree without destroying one another, that a nation could endure endless compromise without consequence, that words were stronger than powder. They were not, and because of Fort Sumter, America would now learn that lesson in blood. The world would remember this moment not for its casualties, but for its consequence. The quiet republic had died at dawn. A nation at war was born before sunrise, and no one alive would ever forget the sound, not because it was loud, but because it ended everything they had known. Chapter 6. The Early War. When the smoke over Charleston finally thinned, America did not wake in terror. It woke in delusion. Men did not mourn the coming of war. They celebrated it. It was not hatred that swept the streets at first. It was excitement. Boys too young to grow whiskers shouldered rifles with proud uncertainty. Old men who could no longer march wrote speeches instead. Women pinned ribbons to uniforms and told themselves that bravery would make their sons bulletproof. Newspapers predicted victory before battle had even been planned. Politicians declared the war would be over by summer. Some said 90 days, others said 2 months. Nobody said years. Nobody said graves by the mile. The North flooded with volunteers, producing an army overnight out of clerks, farmers, dock workers, and schoolboys. The South answered with equal fervor. In dusty towns and plantation yards, men raised handmade flags and drilled under blazing sun. The war was supposed to be a cleansing storm, a violent correction that would pass quickly and leave something better behind. Each side believed God had chosen it. Each side prayed for victory with trembling faith. Each side was wrong. When armies met for the first time near Manassas, Virginia, it did not feel like history. It felt like theater. Spectators rode out from Washington with picnic baskets and opera glasses, eager to watch the battle like curious tourists attending a duel. Young lieutenants wore clean gloves. Commands rang with the crisp absurdity of rehearsal. No one knew yet what war meant in its modern form. Battle came anyway, and it came without permission. At first Bull Run, the illusion was ripped from America's face. The lines did not hold. The commands did not land. Panic replaced order before the day was half over. Soldiers who had marched out to capture glory fled, with terror tearing their lungs. The countryside filled with the sound of boots abandoning the idea of heroism. What followed was not defeat. It was revelation. The nation realized something in its spine. This war was not a spectacle. It was a furnace, and it would burn far hotter than anyone imagined. Neither side emerged from Bull Run with wisdom, only dread. Each army retreated to its side of the river, stunned by how close and how terrible death had suddenly become. Mothers received sons with haunted eyes and unfamiliar silence. Letters home grew quieter. Jokes stopped arriving in the mail. For a brief moment, the country teetered on the edge of sanity. It could still have stopped. It could still have compromised. Instead, it prepared. The North believed in numbers and industry. It had more factories, more railroads, more men. It assumed it would crush the Confederacy through weight and will. It believed mathematics could defeat mythology. The South believed in spirit and soil. Its leaders trusted that men defending homes would fight harder than men defending abstract ideas. They believed sheer conviction would outlast machinery. These beliefs would cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Generals rose overnight. They were not all brilliant. They were not all brave. Some were vain. Some were cautious. Some were catastrophically incompetent. But they were all unprepared. At the helm of the Union Army stood a man who had the confidence of youth and the caution of age. George McClellan arrived like a savior wrapped in silk. He trained the army like a sculptor carving marble, and the men adored him. He drilled them until they looked invincible. Then he refused to use them. Every rumor doubled enemy numbers. Every hill concealed an invisible army. McClellan saw giants where there were men. He protected his army so carefully that he forgot the war did not care what he wanted. Across the battlefield stood a very different soul. Robert E. Lee. He was not loud. He did not posture. But when he stood before troops, something ancient stirred. Lee did not promise easy victories. He promised necessity. He saw the war not as a parade, but as a moral collapse unfolding under command. Where McClellan hesitated, Lee gambled. Where McClellan counted, Lee trusted instinct. Where the Union planned, the Confederacy struck. Small victories began to chain together like cruel miracles. Battles bled into days, days into names, names into legends. The war spread, and with it, the dead. The early casualties shocked no one as much as they surprised. Each side had expected loss. Neither had expected annihilation. The sun did not pause for funerals. Railroads began to carry wounded instead of wheat. Hospitals turned churches into morgues. Surgeons cut without anesthesia. Arms fell like firewood. Legs were stacked like fence rails. And America learned the taste of iron. What had once been a political argument had become an industrial slaughter. The speed of warfare outpaced the mind's ability to understand it. Rifles reached farther, faster. Artillery crushed tents along with men. Battles no longer resolved themselves with lines and flags, but with thunder and disappearance. Men vanished where they stood. The air filled with a noise no one had lived through before. The factories of war were open and working overtime. In letters home, soldiers stopped speaking of victory. They spoke of survival, of rain that tasted like metal, of ground that never dried, of sleep that never came. They wrote that there were no good days, only quieter ones. By the end of the first year, the war had devoured numbers no one had predicted, but it had not devoured resolve. In fact, it fed it. Each fallen sun became an oath. Each burned town produced another enemy. The early war did not exhaust either side. It radicalized them with blood. The South, buoyed by early success, began to believe, not just in defense, but in dominance. The North, humiliated and furious, began to reorganize, not gently, not forgivingly, but with mechanical resolve. The national nervous system tightened. Something deeper than strategy shifted. The war stopped being fought for reasons. It began to be fought for the dead. And the dead were no longer negotiable. The great irony of the early war was that its brutality did not shorten it. It prolonged it. Because each scream hardened hearts. Each coffin created 2 more soldiers. The war fed itself like a living thing. And by the end of it, no one could remember who started it, only that it had begun to take everything. As winter settled in like a wounded animal, America stared at the carnage of its first year and told itself this was the worst part. They were wrong again. The nation had not yet seen what it would do to itself. Not even close. The war was no longer a mistake. It was now a mission, and the cost had stopped mattering. Because the country no longer believed it could afford to lose, only to survive. Chapter 7. The War in the East. The war in the East did not unfold like a campaign. It unfolded like a nightmare that refused to end, replayed on different fields with new names and the same graves. Virginia became the stage of America's torment, the place where the nation returned again and again to punish itself. Roads turned into memory. Fences became landmarks of death. Rivers learned the names of men by heart. And at the center of this vast human chessboard stood two men who could not escape one another. Whether in strategy, fate, or consequence, George McClellan was everything a modern soldier was supposed to be. Young, intelligent, immensely organized. He built the Army of the Potomac into a masterpiece of discipline and order. Camps were tidy, drills precise, uniforms immaculate. The men adored him. They called him Little Mac, with a kind of affection normally reserved for brothers. He gave them structure. He gave them pride. Above all, he gave them something that felt like protection. Yet beneath his brilliance lived fear, not cowardice. Something worse. Doubt. McClellan did not merely fear defeat. He feared misjudgment. He feared moving too quickly. He feared unseen numbers, imaginary armies, shadows crouching just beyond hills. His mind magnified threat until movement itself became dangerous. He counted endlessly. He calculated obsessively. But every calculation brought him to paralysis. Across from him stood not a general, but a ghost out of another era. Robert E. Lee did not build order. He leveraged chaos. He did not count men. He gambled them. Lee believed initiative mattered more than numbers. That boldness created advantage where maps could not. That movement confused enemies more than fire ever could. Where McClellan saw risk as responsibility, Lee saw it as opportunity. He pushed his army to exhaustion and beyond it. He split forces against reason. He marched when others would rest, attacked when others would entrench. And every time he did, his legend grew. Not because it was perfect, but because it was daring. The war in the East became their duel. McClellan pacing through maps, haunted by intelligence reports that grew darker with every retelling. Lee riding the margins, playing with fire and finding salvation inside it. The Peninsula Campaign unfolded like a slow chokehold that never tightened. McClellan had numbers. He had guns. He had roads and rivers under his command. He inched toward Richmond like a man afraid the ground might vanish beneath his boots. And at every step, Lee struck. Sudden offensives, unpredictable pivots, armies that appeared from forests like illusions. McClellan retreated even in moments of strength. Lee advanced even in moments of weakness. The chessboard grew soaked. Men fell not just to bullets, but to exhaustion. Disease claimed more than muskets. Virginia's earth swallowed boys in blue and gray alike. The war became intimate. The distance between cannon and scream shortened. Battles were now suffocating events, not distant conflicts. There was no perspective anymore, only chaos at eye level. Then came a mistake, a piece of paper, a lost order. Union soldiers found the Confederate plans wrapped around cigars, a stroke of accident so absurd it felt like fate laughing aloud. Lee's army lay suddenly naked before McClellan, its movements exposed, its flank vulnerable. All McClellan had to do was move. He hesitated. Even with the enemy's intentions written in ink in his hands, McClellan assumed deception. He believed a trap lay within a gift. He advanced carefully, slowly, always slowly. Lee did not wait. Antietam awaited both of them like a verdict already written. September 17th, 1862 arrived beneath a crimson sky. It would leave red behind. Before sunrise, fields and corn rows were alive with the sound of men breathing their last prayers. Fog rolled low like a warning. The earth held its own breath. Then hell opened. The cornfield became a furnace. Lines of soldiers walked into gunfire as if into storms they could not see. Regiments disintegrated in minutes. Men collapsed without knowing why. Bullets turned cornstalks into flying ribbons of death. Survivors later said the sound of impact never stopped, not for a moment. The same ground changed hands again and again until no one knew who had captured what. The field ceased being a battlefield and became simply a killing floor. By mid-morning, the blood had soaked through boots. By noon, it had become a part of the soil. Dunker Church stood quiet and white amid the thunder, a serene witness to the massacre surrounding it. Its churchyard became a tangle of bodies without sermons, without burial, without mercy. Men were not killed. They were erased. And the sun climbed higher. At Burnside's bridge, soldiers attempted to cross a narrow river while Confederate fire cut into them like paper. Men fell into the water and did not rise. The river carried bodies downstream like dark messages no one wanted to read. Wave after wave destroyed itself against stone and smoke, until finally, the bridge cracked open to Union control. But it was too late. What might have been victory drained into survival. Lee's army did not collapse. Barely. He held when all logic said he should shatter. His men fought with hollow eyes and empty stomachs. But they fought. And McClellan paused again. When the sun finally fell, it did not bring peace. It brought inventory. 22,000 men lay dead or dying between the two armies. 22,000 in a single day. Antietam was not its name then. It was only agony. No battle before it in American history had come close, and nothing after it would shrink its shadow. McClellan had not lost. But he had not won. Lee had not triumphed, but he had not fallen. It was called victory in the North because Lee retreated. But the men who stood ankle-deep in bodies did not feel victorious. They felt emptied. The aftermath looked like the end of the world. Limbs scattered like debris, faces gray with dew and shock, wounded crying into dirt, men begging not for life, but for death to hurry. The earth breathed rot, and the Republic inhaled. President Lincoln came to Antietam later and stood quiet among the wreckage. It was then he understood something he could no longer deny. The war could no longer be justified as merely a fight to preserve borders. The nation was demanding something larger, something moral, something worthy of the dead. Antietam gave him that. The Emancipation Proclamation followed like a thunderclap after lightning. Freedom had now joined the war, and the war did not soften. It hardened. McClellan lost command not for losing battles, but for failing to win them. Lee remained where he was, battered and revered, a gambler playing a game that devoured his army piece by piece. Virginia continued to bleed, and the war in the East ceased to be about movement. It became about endurance, about who could absorb more screams, about whose future could withstand more graves. Every victory tasted like ash. Every loss felt infinite. And somewhere beneath the fields of Antietam, a nation lay underneath its own weight, still not knowing if it would rise again. Chapter 8. The War in the West. While the war in the East consumed itself in spectacle and torment, another war unfolded farther west that bore no resemblance to glory. There were no grand capitals to threaten, no marble monuments to defend. There was instead a stretch of land so vast and brutal that it seemed designed to erase human ambition. The Western theater swallowed soldiers not in famous charges, but in mud, water, fever, and exhaustion. Here the war was not a pageant. It was attrition made visible. The land itself fought. Rivers were not boundaries. They were highways for death. The Mississippi cut the Confederacy in half like a blade, and whoever controlled it would control the war's spine. Forts were not castles here. They were soggy earthen scars, trying desperately to hold back iron fleets. Roads dissolved under marching feet. Wagons sank. Horses collapsed. Men learned that the earth could be an enemy more relentless than any army. It was here that a man few respected became the most important man in the Union military. Ulysses S. Grant did not look like a legend. He did not sound like one either. He had been a failure in civilian life. Loans unpaid, jobs abandoned, dreams stained with whiskey and humiliation. His troops doubted him. His superiors resented him. Rumors of drinks swirled around him like flies around a wound. He did not deny them. He did not explain himself. He simply stood and waited. And when the war found him, it did not find him waiting anymore. Grant did not believe in elegant wars. He believed in finished ones. He had no illusions about heroism. He wanted pressure. He wanted movement. He wanted the enemy to feel hunted, not threatened. Most of all, he wanted them never to rest. Where other generals paused, Grant advanced. Where others reorganized, Grant attacked. Where others worried about perfection, Grant pursued momentum. His strategy was as brutal as it was simple. Keep moving, never stop. Let the enemy bleed every hour of every day. Victory was not an event. It was an accumulation of suffering. From the moment Grant captured Fort Donelson with the words, "No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender," his reputation transformed. The North, desperate for triumph, latched onto his blunt ferocity like a drowning man grabbing iron. Grant did not write speeches. He wrote orders, and they bled into rivers. The Tennessee River became his marcher's road. Gunboats churned through murky water like floating cities of thunder. Cannon fire echoed across riversides where only birds had once spoken. Soldiers camped in swamps and learned that insects killed as efficiently as bullets. Dysentery burned. Fever drowned. Bodies were buried shallow where graves immediately filled with water. In the West, there were no neat funerals, only disappearance. Grant's objective narrowed until it mirrored obsession. The Mississippi, the river that made nations, the river that would break one. If the North could seize it, the Confederacy would be severed, starved, strangled. Atop a defensive cliff overlooking the river sat Vicksburg. It was not a city. It was a fortress disguised as one. Crowned with artillery and carved by trenches, Vicksburg was the southern gatekeeper. Confederates believed it could not fall. Not by land, not by water, not by any force short of divine betrayal. Grant made no speeches to his men. He simply pointed. They marched. His campaign was a nightmare, stitched together with river crossings, false starts, sudden marches, and moments of pure audacity that seemed reckless until they worked. Grant cut himself loose from supply lines and dared starvation. He forced his army to live off conquered land and fever-polluted water. He gambled not with coins, but with men. At times, his plans failed spectacularly. Lives were wasted. Frustration festered. Critics sharpened knives made of ink. But Grant did not stop. He did not step back. He did not abandon. He circled Vicksburg like a predator circling a dying animal, and no citizen inside the city felt safe from that circle tightening. When his assaults against the city's defenses failed, he did not call it defeat. He called it a siege. Vicksburg was cut from the world. No food, no escape, no hope. Inside the city, hunger became constant and humiliation familiar. Families lived in caves carved into hillsides to escape artillery. Dogs and rats vanished from streets, hunted into extinction by desperation. People ate mule meat, then leather, then nothing. Children grew thin as memory. Mothers prayed in whispers. Each shell that fell did not simply destroy buildings, it shattered sanity. The siege did not roar like battle. It whispered like death. For 47 days, Grant allowed the city to rot. When Vicksburg finally collapsed, it did not fall in glory. It withered in starvation. On July 4th, 1863, the Confederate Army surrendered. Flags lowered slowly. Rations were accepted with trembling hands. Men who had been defenders became skeletons, and the Mississippi became a Union artery. The Confederacy was now severed. 2 days earlier, Gettysburg had stolen the nation's eyes. But Vicksburg stole the war. The West had done what the East only dreamed. It had broken something permanent, and Grant had become more than a general. He had become inevitability. But inevitability required another instrument, a man whose mind had already parted with mercy. William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman did not believe in gentle war. He believed in ending it. He had suffered breakdowns early in the conflict from seeing too clearly. While others dressed war in banners and songs, Sherman saw only graves. He did not glorify blood. He respected it, because he knew how much would be required, and he intended to use it all if necessary. He did not separate civilian and soldier in his calculations. He separated useful and gone. In Sherman's war, infrastructure was the enemy. Railroads would not be cut. They would be twisted into artless sculptures of ruin. Crops would not be seized. They would be burned. Cities would not be threatened. They would be hollowed. War would no longer ask permission. It would consume. When Sherman marched through Georgia toward the sea, it was not an invasion. It was a cleansing, a 400-mile scar carved into the South's spine. His army moved without supply lines, without restraint, without apology. The Confederacy could fight armies. It could not fight empty fields. It could not fight terror. Sherman understood what Grant had proven. The will to wage war lived not only in soldiers, but in soil, and he intended to destroy both. By the time Sherman reached Savannah, the Confederacy was no longer fighting to win. It was fighting to breathe. The Western theater had succeeded where decoration had failed. It had strangled, by river, by railroad, by starvation, by exhaustion. The war in the West did not conquer territory. It conquered the future. And as news traveled east of Grant's advance and Sherman's destruction, the meaning of the war changed for everyone who still carried a rifle. The North no longer fought to preserve Union. It fought to finish the job. And the Confederacy began to feel something worse than defeat. It felt irreversible, because the war had found new architects, and they did not build. They ended. Chapter 9. Emancipation. When the war began, it wore the uniform of preservation. Restore the Union, hold the borders, keep the experiment alive. Freedom was spoken in whispers, but Antietam changed that. 22,000 men fell in a single day, and in their blood, something finally broke open. The country could no longer pretend it was only fighting for territory. Too many lives had been spent for a mere line on a map. Too many mothers had buried sons for a political abstraction. The war demanded a reason equal to its dead. Abraham Lincoln stood beneath that weight, like a man condemned by history before judgment. He had resisted emancipation not because he doubted its righteousness, but because he feared its consequence. He knew the South would erupt. He knew Democrats would splinter. He knew border states might flee. He knew European powers might intervene. He knew the nation might collapse faster if he touched slavery than if he left it alone. And still, he waited for the moment when not acting would become the greater sin. That moment came on a harvested field in Maryland. Antietam did not end the war. It gave it a soul. In the silence that followed that slaughter, Lincoln turned from preservation into prophecy. He drafted words not as policy, but as judgment. And when he finally signed his name beneath them, the character of the war shifted forever. The Emancipation Proclamation was not merely a law, it was a moral earthquake. The war ceased being a dispute between governments and became something older, deeper, and infinitely more dangerous. A war for human meaning. It did not free every slave, but it changed everything. From that moment on, the Confederacy was no longer merely rebelling. It was defending bondage. And the Union was no longer merely consolidating territory. It was fighting for the idea of freedom itself. America had crossed a line from which it could never retreat. And the world was watching. Across Europe, politicians studied Lincoln's words like battlefield maps. Britain and France had flirted dangerously with recognizing the Confederacy, tempted by Southern cotton and seduced by neutrality. But emancipation polluted every conversation with uncertainty. To side with the South now meant to defend slavery openly. Diplomacy became morality's captive. No European crown wanted to wear that stain. What had once been a civil war became an ideological war. And ideology attracts witnesses. Within the United States, the new war tore something open that could never be contained again. Millions who had once been treated as property heard liberty spoken as policy. Word traveled faster than bullets through slave quarters and cramped cabins. Songs spread, scripture burned brighter. Rumor became hope. If the North won, whatever chains had bound them might finally die. Escaped slaves poured into Union camps. They arrived exhausted, starving, and terrified, yet filled with something newly dangerous: expectation. At first, soldiers did not know what to do with them. Some welcomed, others resented. Some pitied, some exploited. The army itself was as divided as the nation had been. But over time, a new vision formed within the ranks. If this war was now about freedom, then those denied it must stand in its defense. Black men began to enlist, not in dozens, in thousands, by the tens of thousands. Former slaves became soldiers. Former chains became muskets. Their uniforms did not fit well. Their weapons often arrived late. Their pay sometimes arrived never. But they marched anyway, not because they were asked, but because they refused to wait. They did not fight for vengeance. They fought for existence, for the right to stand upright, for the right to be men. And the war felt their arrival like a second ignition. Where Confederate soldiers once feared defeat, they now feared extinction. The idea of armed black men terrified the South beyond reason. This was not simply military resistance. It was social apocalypse. For generations, the South had sold the myth that slaves were passive, inferior, docile. Emancipation shattered the lie. Every black regiment that marched was proof of betrayal, not by the North, but by reality itself. The Confederacy responded with fury. Captured black soldiers were murdered or returned to chains. Officers who commanded them were executed. The war grew teeth. Compassion withered. The further emancipation spread, the more desperate the South became. Desperation does not govern gently. It scorches. And still Lincoln did not falter. He had once feared emancipation might destroy the Union. He now knew it was the only thing that could save it. Inside his office, he carried with him the faces of the dead. He read casualty numbers with a quiet that frightened those who brought them. He spoke of God as if arguing with him, not praying to him. He did not claim righteousness. He sought justification, and every night, sleep fled him. The war had grown heavier, not in arms, in meaning. Churches changed their sermons, newspapers changed their language, soldiers changed their letters. The war was no longer described as tragic necessity. It was described as holy burden, and holy burdens demand sacrifice. In the camps, hymns replaced banter. Men who had marched for paycheck and pride now marched for judgment. There is a point in every war where survival stops being enough. America had reached it. The nation's conscience had been awakened violently, and it did not scream. It wept. Yet emancipation did not soften the war. It sharpened it. Once slavery had been declared incompatible with victory. Nothing short of total collapse would satisfy either side. The Confederacy could not negotiate away the very system on which it rested. The North could not abandon the emancipated without betraying the meaning of its own bloodshed. There was no middle left, no retreat possible. The war became absolute. On Southern plantations, whispers turned into flight. Whole families vanished overnight. In Northern camps, tents filled with children no soldier had expected to carry. The earth itself seemed to rearrange beneath this shift. Fields once planted with cotton were now battlefields. Churches became hospitals. Markets became mustering points. And all of it moved towards something like fate. When black soldiers fought, they fought knowing surrender meant death or chains. Their courage was edged with annihilation. Every volley they fired was an argument against centuries of injustice. Every casualty wore history in his uniform. They were not merely soldiers. They were historians, writing the future in blood. And beneath it all, Lincoln remained. Alone, hollowed, watching the war mutate before his eyes. He had unleashed freedom, and freedom did not return quietly to its cage. The war did not become kinder, but it became clearer. America would not merely decide its borders. It would decide its soul. And once a nation questions its soul, there are no peaceful answers left, only necessary ones. As cannon smoke drifted higher and freedom crept lower into old chains' shadows, something else began to fade as well. The fantasy that this war could end gently. The fantasy that it could end quickly. The fantasy that it could end without rewriting the country all the way down to its bones. America had changed what it was fighting for. And now, the war demanded everything in return. Right. Chapter 10. Gettysburg. The road north felt like a promise whispered by fate itself. For Robert E. Lee, the invasion of Pennsylvania was not recklessness. It was necessity disguised as audacity. The South was starving. Its fields were scorched, its railroads sputtered, its people were exhausting themselves to feed a war that returned only grief. Lee believed one thing could still save the Confederacy. Victory so undeniable that the North would beg for peace, and Europe would finally take notice. One decisive blow, one victory so large it could rewrite the future. And so Lee marched, across the Potomac, into enemy land, into history. But uneasy hearts marched with him. His most trusted lieutenant, James Longstreet, did not share the dream. Longstreet carried war in his gut, not on maps. He had seen too many graves to believe in miracles. He begged Lee not to fight on unfamiliar ground. He urged defense instead of assault. He warned that Union strength was rising and Confederate strength was thinning by every mile. Lee heard him and dismissed him. Victory had kissed Lee too often for him to doubt her now. The ghost of invincibility followed him north, whispering that destiny did not favor hesitation. Gettysburg waited in silence. It was a town of shoe factories, not soldiers. It had no intention of becoming sacred ground. Yet it lay at the crossroads of armies like a casual offering to fate. When Confederate troops stumbled upon Union cavalry on its outskirts in early July of 1863, no one planned a grand battle. They merely collided. And when two giants collide, the earth does not consent. The first day burned hot and fast. Chaos ruled. Union lines bent but did not break. Confederate momentum surged through streets and fields, past barns and fences, through blood and dust. By nightfall, the Southern Army believed it had everything in hand. They were wrong. The second day built tension until it screamed. Union forces entrenched themselves along high ground, shaped like a hook in the land. Cemetery Ridge, Culp's Hill, Little Round Top. The landscape itself seemed to resist Lee's advance. Each rise in elevation cost flesh. Longstreet begged again. Flank them. Wait, make them come to you. Lee refused. His eyes were fixed on impossible horizons. He ordered direct assaults against fortified positions, believing the Union line could be shattered by sheer conviction. It took everything for the Confederate soldiers to obey, because they understood the cost. When the fighting reached Little Round Top, time itself felt cornered. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain stood with the 20th Maine at the edge of collapse. His men were low on ammunition, low on hope, high on fear. Confederate forces climbed toward them like a rising tide of death. The Maine regiment was the hinge of the entire Union line. If they broke, so would the nation. Chamberlain had never led men into something like this. He had been a scholar, not a soldier. He had walked into war carrying books in his memory. Now he carried lives. The Confederate charge nearly shattered his men. Volley after volley tore into them. Bodies tumbled down the hillside. Blood made the slopes slick. Orders dissolved into screams. When the last cartridges were fired, Chamberlain faced eternity with nothing but instinct. And he gave an order no manual taught. Bayonets. Charge. The world inverted. Men who had been bracing for death became it. They surged down the hill like a storm unchained, steel flashing in the dying light. Confederate lines collapsed not from strength, but from shock. The impossible stand had succeeded. Little Round Top held, and with it, history. The third day arrived like a sentence spoken aloud. Everything rested on it now. Lee believed the Union center had been weakened, that the previous day's fury had fractured resolve, that his men, though exhausted, could still break the enemy with one unimaginable blow. Longstreet did not speak in argument on the morning of July 3rd. He had given up on words. He simply nodded. A man preparing to watch destiny collapse cannot bear conversation. Pickett's division stood in lines so beautiful, they did not look real. Thousands of men dressed in gray, stretching across open fields like living targets under a merciless sky. No place to hide, no hope for surprise, and no turning back. They waited in the heat while Confederate artillery thundered ahead of them. Shells screamed through the air in preparation. Earth shook, men sweated, some prayed, Some stared straight ahead as if daring the future to blink first. Then the guns fell silent, and the men were told to walk. They stepped forward not as a wave, but as a procession to extinction. Cannons roared again, but this time from the Union line. Steel ripped into ranks, whole rows vanished mid-stride. Men fell without sound, others walked through explosions as if hypnotized. The field did not reject them, it swallowed them. Flags dropped and were raised again by different hands that lasted only seconds. Blood soaked the ground so deeply it seemed to drink the men themselves. Some reached the wall. Few crossed it. Those who did were greeted by rifle fire at arm's length. There are moments in history when courage is so great it becomes unbearable. Pickett's charge was one of them. It was not heroic, it was terminal. When it ended, the Confederate Army did not retreat. It simply stood still, staring at what it had done to itself. Lee rode among the remnants and whispered apologies. "I thought you could do it." No general in American history had ever borne such guilt aloud, and no army had ever felt it so deeply. The high water mark of the Confederacy had passed. It flowed now only backward. That night, rain washed blood into the Pennsylvania soil, like the land itself was weeping. Fires burned low. Survivors wandered the fields looking for anyone still alive. There were too many to count, too many to bury. Gettysburg was not a battlefield. It was a mass grave with a name. In Washington, Lincoln read reports with trembling hands. He did not celebrate, he did not shout, he almost collapsed. It was a victory not as triumph, but as unbearable relief. The nation could breathe again. Barely. Months later, he would return to that field not to praise the fallen, but to speak to the future. And when he did, the man who spoke was no longer just a president. He was a prophet with a war behind his eyes. He would not speak of victory. He would speak of purpose. He would tell a broken nation why the dead had not died for nothing. And in doing so, he would change history's language forever. Gettysburg did not save the Union outright, but it made its salvation possible. And that is perhaps the cruelest and greatest victory of all, because the cost could never be repaid, only remembered. Chapter 11. Sherman's March and the Collapse of the South. By the winter of 1864, the war had begun to feel less like a struggle between armies and more like a reckoning with fate itself. Victory in the East at Gettysburg had cracked the Confederacy's illusions. Grant's victories in the West had split its body. But nothing had yet touched its heart. Its people still spoke of endurance, of miracle, of holding out just long enough for something, anything, to change. Then William Tecumseh Sherman began to move. Not like a general, like a disease. When he turned away from Atlanta and pointed his columns toward the sea, the world seemed to pause in disbelief. He cut himself off from supply lines, not as a risk, but as a declaration. He would not feed his men with wagons and warehouses. He would feed them with the South. It was not madness. It was certainty. Sherman did not want to fight Southern armies. He wanted to break Southern reality. He understood something that many still pretended not to see. This war would not end when armies were defeated. It would end when the South could no longer imagine fighting. So he marched not toward soldiers, but toward meaning. His army moved in a wide arc, like jaws closing around a dying animal. They did not always burn, but they took. They stripped railways down to warm ribbon torsion. They emptied smokehouses. They smashed looms. They left homes standing and futures broken. Fields emptied into blackened silence. There was no organized resistance, only fear. Families watched blue columns pass their doors like inevitable weather. Mothers hid what little they could, sometimes burying food in graves, as if trusting the dead to guard it better than the living could. Children ran barefoot over shattered glass and ashes, trying to understand why the world was ending without explosion. The soldiers sang. The civilians whispered. The earth listened. Sherman's men were not monsters. They were worse. They were convinced. They saw the war as arithmetic, a calculation of inevitability. If they destroyed the economic and emotional ability to fight, the war would end sooner. If it ended sooner, fewer men would die. If fewer men died, brutality became mercy, wearing an unfamiliar face. But mercy does not sound gentle when it arrives with torches, or it sounds like ruin. Southern pride cracked quietly at first. People told themselves they could endure deprivation before. They believed memory and dignity would outlast hunger. Then hunger learned their names. Cities did not fall. They hollowed. Villages did not vanish. They withered. The sound of the war changed. No longer thunder from battlefields. Instead, it hissed in kitchens. It moaned in barns. It knocked on doors on nights with no moon. Confederate currency became worthless paper in trembling hands. Shops emptied. Roads were filled with refugees dragging possessions that the future no longer wanted. Sherman did not stop at Savannah. He simply turned north. And that was when the South began to understand. The war was no longer something happening at the edges. It was happening inside. Inside cities, inside homes, inside stomachs, inside souls. There was no safe interior anymore. Every road was vulnerable. Every harvest was contested. Every winter night came with the suspicion that by morning, something essential would vanish. Not burned. Gone. Confederate leaders spoke in public with swelling righteousness. In private, some wept. They had promised their people glory. They were delivering extinction. And what frightened them more than defeat was this. The North no longer needed the South to surrender. It simply needed it to disappear. Sherman's march did not look like conquest. It looked like erosion. And erosion does not care how loudly a thing screams. It wears it away anyway. Inside the Confederate Army, morale began to rot. Not in one grand collapse, but in 1,000 silent desertions. Men slipped away into forests at dusk, too ashamed to say goodbye and too exhausted to continue pretending. Others stayed but stopped believing. They loaded rifles more slowly, marched without rhythm, listened to officers as if listening to ghosts who had not yet realized they were dead. The South had always believed it would outfight the North. It had not considered the possibility of being unfed. Meanwhile, Sherman sent a telegram from Savannah to President Lincoln. "I beg to present you, as a Christmas gift, the city of Savannah." It was not written in triumph. It was written in certainty. The war had become mechanical. The Confederacy was being dismantled like an old machine no longer fit for repair. Each gear removed was one more reason to quit. But quitting is not a habit learned easily by people raised on honor. So the South endured. And because it endured, it suffered. Long after reason begged for mercy, pride demanded more blood. By the time Sherman swept into the Carolinas, the last illusions cracked. South Carolina, the state that had started everything, now tasted consequence at the mouth. Cities burned, not out of rage, out of logic. Sherman made his harshest statement not through proclamations, but through flame. The South had demanded fire. Now it received it. The war that had once been dressed in ceremony and speeches ended where it began, in the brutal simplicity of hunger and horror. Nothing romantic survived Sherman's march. There were no banners that could fly in ash, no poetry that could survive starvation, no speeches that could rebuild what fear had unbuilt. In Richmond, President Jefferson Davis walked the halls of a collapsing illusion. His armies were shrinking. His cities were emptying. His generals were running out of air. The only thing they had left in abundance was inevitability. The Confederacy no longer dreamed of victory. It dreamed of time. More time. Just enough time for negotiation. Just enough time for consequences to soften. Just enough time for the North to grow tired. But this longing betrayed its own emptiness. The North was not tired. It had been sharpened. The South now said in prayer what it would never admit aloud. We cannot win. We can only delay. And delay is not strategy. It is surrender stretched thin. The civilians understood this before the generals ever would. They read it in the hunger of children, in the silence of churches, in the cold kitchens without flour, in empty chairs, in the sound of nothing where life used to be. The South had tried to remain a nation. It had become a wound instead. And wounds do not negotiate. They either heal or they kill. As spring of 1865 approached, the Confederacy was no longer bleeding. It was emptying, draining, quieting. Men still fought, but they fought with the hollow strength of people walking toward sleep. The war's voice had changed, no longer shouting, whispering, a whisper that said the same thing over and over to anyone willing to listen. It is ending, whether you are ready or not. Sherman had not conquered the South. He had unmade it. And in doing so, he forced the Confederacy to confront a truth more terrifying than defeat. It had never truly been a nation at all. It had been a moment, a dream held together by fear and cotton. And now that dream was burning, not from hatred, but from exposure. The anaconda had not crushed with jaws. It had tightened with patience. And there is no defense against patience, when it knows you are already dying. Chapter 12. Appomattox and the Death of the Confederacy. By the spring of 1865, the Confederacy was no longer fighting a war. It was running from one. The final act of that long tragedy opened not with cannons, but with silence. So heavy it felt like morning itself had taken form in the air. Richmond stood hollowed and stunned, its streets echoing with the ghosts of promises long abandoned. Smoke clung to neighborhoods like a memory no rain could wash away. Government buildings felt cavernous, stripped of purpose. The capital of a rebellion now housed only its vacancy. Inside it, Jefferson Davis waited for news that would no longer arrive. Outside it, Robert E. Lee was running out of road. The siege of Petersburg had done what years of open battle could not. It had ground the Army of Northern Virginia into dust. 40 miles of trenches wrapped the city in a slow death, a prototype of the nightmares yet to come in another century. Men lived underground like ghosts. Rats grew fearless. Mud swallowed boots. Disease crept into bones. Shell fire reshaped the earth daily. Soldiers learned the shape of the sky by how it erupted. And through it all moved Grant. Not with theater, with pressure. He did not attack to inspire. He attacked to exhaust. Every night, Confederate soldiers listened to the creeping thunder of Federal artillery, measuring distance not in yards, but in heartbeats. There was no peace in darkness. Only the promise that morning would bring it closer. And it did. When Petersburg finally cracked, it did not shatter loudly. It collapsed quietly. Lee evacuated Richmond in an almost ceremonial retreat, the last government wagons rumbling through empty streets as fire raced across public buildings like a funeral pyre lit by history itself. Citizens awoke to see their city dissolving in smoke and ash, watching their world burn not as an enemy act, but as farewell. The Confederacy's last symbolism died in its capital's glow. Lee's men now became refugees. They walked not in formation, but in exhaustion. Shoeless, starving, ill. They marched with muskets and memories and little else. What had once been an army now resembled a pilgrimage of the defeated. Grant followed. He did not pursue revenge. He pursued conclusion. There was no rage in his strategy anymore, only inevitability. His cavalry cut across Lee's path like the closing of a door. His infantry drifted forward like sunrise creeping through fog. There was no escape that did not lead backward. Every road led to Appomattox. Lee knew it. His officers knew it. His men felt it in their bones. There were moments during that retreat when the past still whispered promises. Perhaps one more battle. Perhaps one more miracle. But miracles do not come when men have nothing left to offer but bodies. The final hope dissolved at Sailor's Creek, where dreams disintegrated into hopeless stands and scattered formations. Confederate soldiers surrendered by the thousands, offering weapons as one might offer apologies. The geography of Virginia grew thick with defeat. And Lee continued, not because he believed, but because he owed his men the truth should be witnessed with dignity. When the road ended, the world did not explode. It exhaled. Appomattox Courthouse sat nestled among quiet hills and blooming trees. Birds sang as if unburdened by history. The spring air was gentle. The world behaved as though nothing momentous was unfolding. And that was its cruelty. Lee arrived dressed not as a myth, but as a man. His uniform was immaculate, his posture unmoving. But his eyes carried 4 years of graves. Grant arrived later, mud-spattered, simple, no fanfare, no sword gleaming in the sun. 2 men met in a room barely large enough to contain their lives. There were no speeches, only silence. The terms were brief, generous. Grant did not demand humiliation. He demanded closure. Men were allowed to keep horses. Officers could keep swords. There would be no trials, no examinations, no manufactured shame. The war would not end as spectacle, but as surrender. Lee spoke with restraint, as if holding himself together with thread. Grant listened, and in listening, he built the future. When the papers were signed, Lee did not collapse. He did not curse. He did not rage. He stood, drawn, defeated, entire. And then he left. Lee walked into April's sunlight like a man leaving a funeral in which he had been both priest and corpse. Outside, soldiers waited. Some wept. Some stared. Some could not breathe. When Lee mounted his horse and rode away, no one cheered. No one shouted. The war ended without thunder, because it had already exhausted every scream. Grant famously ordered no celebration. This was not a triumph. It was a burial. Union soldiers removed their caps as Confederate troops stacked weapons for the last time. This was not disarmament. It was unmaking. The rifles that had defined them were surrendered like identities placed on graves. Men whose entire sense of self had been forged in fire now stood naked in peace, unsure how to live without war instructing their heartbeat. The Confederacy died that day, not with defiance, but with exhaustion. No songs crowned it. No statues were erected. No banners flew. Only one word passed from mouth to mouth like a forbidden prayer. Finished. But wars do not truly finish. They settle, they seep, they stain. The men who walked away from Appomattox did not walk back into life. They wandered into memory. Grant returned to his army and felt no victory, only quiet, only an unnamed carryover of sorrow. Lee returned to private life like a specter, a general without an army, a country without a country. The war that had promised to decide everything did. But it solved nothing. It only ended. And sometimes, ending is the hardest thing a nation ever does. As night fell over Appomattox, the animals returned first. Birds climbed back into branches. Wind moved through grass without asking permission. Life did what life always does. It continued. Humans did not know how. They would have to learn again how to live without bayonets, how to walk without listening for cannon, how to sleep without terror whispering in their mouths. They would have to relearn what peace demanded. And peace would demand more than war ever had. The war had taken their youth, their brothers, their sons, their certainty. Now peace would demand something far more unsettling. Forgiveness. And forgiveness would not come easily to a nation built on graves. As Lee rode southward into silence and Grant turned northward into burden, the Confederacy passed from the living into history. And America remained, scarred, exhausted, breathing, but forever changed by the sound of a war that ended not with fire, but with a pen. Chapter 13. Lincoln's Assassination. The war had finally loosened its grip. For the first time in 4 years, mornings arrived without immediate dread. Men walked streets not waiting for telegrams. Mothers slept through the night without imagining footsteps that were not there. The cannons were quiet. The rivers no longer carried uniforms. The country stood at the edge of something fragile and unfamiliar. Peace. It did not arrive triumphantly. It arrived carefully, like a wounded thing. Abraham Lincoln had lived 4 years inside a storm that never paused. And by April of 1865, it had carved him into something quieter and older than his age. His hair had grayed too quickly. His shoulders seemed heavier than his frame could support. His face had lost the warmth of illusion, but his eyes had not grown cruel. If anything, they had grown softer. Victory had come to him not as deliverance, but as exhaustion. Washington decorated itself as if trying to convince the world it was whole again. Flags lifted lazily in sunlight. Windows glowed. Laughter returned cautiously to places that had forgotten its sound. The city breathed in a way it had not since before the war. On April 14th, Lincoln decided to go out, not to speak, not to command, but to sit among people. Ford's Theater had always been a place where stories pretended to be harmless. That night, it would hold the most unbearable truth the nation had ever known. He did not want to go. Those close to him could tell. He had been dreaming. Not restful dreams, not visions of triumph, but the quiet kind that arrive when a man's soul is too tired to pretend. Yet he went. For his wife, for the country, for normalcy. He entered the theater not like a king, but like a man who wanted to belong to an evening that wasn't history. The audience stood, applauded, smiled. The war's architect now received peace like a stranger still learning its language. He sat. The lights dimmed, and laughter returned to a nation still unsure if it remembered how. Behind him, something else returned too. Hatred did not wear a face then. It wore purpose. John Wilkes Booth did not walk into the balcony like a madman. He walked like a man who believed history had chosen him. His was not a criminal's posture. It was devotion dressed as destiny. He waited for a laugh to swallow the room, then fired. The sound did not explode. It sank, injected. The president did not cry out. He simply fell. And in that fall, the country fell with him. The theater did not know yet what it had just seen. Confusion rippled outward like a slow tide. People leaned forward, not understanding, not believing. Then a man leapt to the stage and shouted words that no one heard clearly enough to remember without distortion. And the truth finally landed. The president had been shot. Panic did not arrive loudly. It arrived numb. Doctors rushed. Hands trembled. The audience went silent, not out of fear, but reverence, as if something sacred had just been wounded. And it had. Lincoln was carried across the street like a broken relic to a small room in Peterson House. They laid him across a bed too small. His body curled as if trying to apologize for taking up space he had no right to anymore. The doctors could do nothing. The wound was mortal from the moment it existed. They did not say it aloud, but everyone knew. He did not wake. He did not speak. He hovered in a place where history could not reach him anymore. Outside, Washington wept, not with hysteria, with disbelief. Citizens gathered in clusters as if drawn together by grief's gravity. Some knelt on streets still warm from sun. Some stood without speaking. Some leaned into strangers like orphans. The war had ended, and then it hadn't. Because now the nation was bleeding again, not from its body, from its heart. Office bearers arrived with red eyes and hollow voices. Generals removed hats not out of custom, but instinct. Cabinet members stood in the room like ghosts, waiting for permission to exist. Lincoln lay breathing slowly. Each breath sounded like a question. No one knew when it would be his last. Through the dark hours, the country waited by candlelight, like a child listening for a parent to return, and then the breathing stopped. At 7:22 in the morning, someone whispered that he was gone, and no one believed it. Then someone said it again, and the word stayed. Lincoln did not die loudly. He died like a man who had already given everything. In a quiet room, on a bed too small, with the world unfinished outside his door. Across the nation, church bells tolled not in pattern, but in pain. Presses printed his death in disbelief. Soldiers collapsed to their knees like men shot after the war was already over. Former slaves who had never seen his face wept as if they had lost a father. Because in many ways they had. He had never been perfect. But he had been brave. He had not promised paradise. But he had delivered freedom, and freedom had cost him his life. The country dressed itself in black. Windows darkened. Nations sent condolences like echoes across oceans. Flags dropped, not from ceremony, but from mourning. The funeral train took his body home through a nation transformed irrevocably by his absence. Towns lined tracks in silence. People stood in rain without umbrellas, letting grief wash through them openly. Children stared at the flag-draped coffin like it might move again. It did not. The war had taken fathers and sons by the millions. But it took something else with Lincoln. It took the future's voice. Because Lincoln had not only fought slaughter with strategy, he had fought hatred with restraint. And restraint cannot survive long without its keeper. The nation had been saved. But it had lost the only man who could have healed it. Victory had arrived. But it tasted like funeral bread. And the question hung unsaid across the continent like a shroud. Who will hold us together now? The peace he had carried so carefully, broken in the very moment it finally arrived. Not by an army, not by a cannon, by one man who believed the war had not ended. because he had not yet been heard. Lincoln became more in death than he had been in life, not because he sought martyrdom, but because he refused to run from responsibility. He did not die for revenge. He died for reunion, and reunion would not come gently without him. The war had finally ended, but now, America would have to survive peace alone. Chapter 14. Reconstruction. The war did not end when the rifles were stacked. It ended when the world they had destroyed failed to return. The South lay in ruins beneath a sky that no longer recognized it. Cities were skeletal. Railroads knotted into rusted bones. Fields lay scorched and silent. The great houses that had once ruled the countryside stood hollowed by fire and theft, reduced to echoes of vanished certainty. Where wealth had once grown from the soil like a second crop, hunger now rose instead. The Confederacy had not merely surrendered, it had collapsed inward. Plantations were no longer empires. They were accused monuments to a crime now written into law. Ownership of human beings had ended in ink and blood, but its shadow still wrapped itself around homes and memories. Freedom arrived carrying nothing but itself. To the enslaved who became the freed, victory was not celebration. It was disorientation. Men and women walked off plantations with no money, no land, and no protection beyond fragile proclamations carried in pockets like talismans. Parents searched for children sold years earlier across counties and states, following rumors like ghosts. Families built lives from rumor and ash. Some stayed, some ran. All wondered whether freedom would shelter them or simply make them visible. For the first time, Black Americans were not property. And for the first time, they were under open attack. The war had destroyed the Southern economy, but it had not destroyed its rage. It had only sharpened it. In the North, victory did not bring unity. It brought fracture. The man who had held the moral center of the war was dead. And now power spread like a spill rather than being carried. Some demanded revenge, others pardons. Some wanted to rebuild the South. Others wanted to break it forever. The echo of triumph faded quickly, replaced by exhaustion and mistrust. In Washington, the future was argued in law and decided in shadows. The new president promised mercy, perhaps too much of it. Plantation owners who had financed rebellion were forgiven swiftly. Confederate officers walked back into their old fields unchanged, except in title. The machinery of the old world reassembled itself piece by piece under the disguise of reconciliation. Those who had lost the war did not lose their influence. They lost only their calendar. Freedom changed 1,000 lives and left 10,000 untended. The South filled its legislatures again. New flag, old men, same hunger for control. They wrote laws that did not say slavery, but meant not equal. They restricted movement. They restricted wages. They restricted voting. They learned how to revise history not by editing textbooks, but by designing systems. Then the night began to organize. In forests and fields, men gathered not as citizens, but as shadows. They wore no uniforms and carried no flags. Their robes were stitched from fear. Their songs were whispered threats. Their justice wore a hood. They called themselves protectors. They were executioners. Terrorism returned the South to control faster than any election ever could. Former slaves were hunted for daring to exist publicly. Teachers were beaten. Ministers were hung from trees. Ballot boxes were burned. Entire communities were warned to lower their eyes or lose their lives. The war had taught America how to kill. Reconstruction taught it how to haunt. Federal troops were sent south not as conquerors, but as guardians. They stood between black citizens and white mobs like thin lines drawn in blood and authority. Schools opened in shattered towns like candles lit against darkness. Churches became classrooms. Literacy became defiance. Learning to read became a revolutionary act. For a moment, for one brief, trembling moment, the future opened. Black men voted. Black men held office. Black families built homes. Black writers wrote truth against centuries of silence. And the South raged. The idea of change did not terrify the South. The possibility of equality did. And so the gloves came off. Corruption moved like a second army behind public faces. Bribes replaced bullets. Courts bowed. Sheriffs disappeared on nights they should have been present. Each election felt like a gamble and a potential funeral. Reconstruction was never simply about rebuilding. It was about replacing an entire soul. And the old one refused to go quietly. In northern cities, the appetite for justice grew thin. The war had emptied families and wallets alike. Veterans returned home broken and forgotten too quickly. People who had survived the carnage resented being asked to care. Southern suffering became familiar. And then it became inconvenient. The moral fire that had fueled emancipation cooled beneath the weight of exhaustion. Newspapers moved on. Politicians recalculated. The nation shifted its attention like a bruise aching in the distance. Little by little, protection faded. Compromise returned, and compromise heard the voice of power more clearly than it heard the prayers of the weak. Federal troops withdrew. Votes were overturned. Courts looked away. Violence went unpunished. The lights went out one by one. What the Civil War had ended with blood, Reconstruction ended with abandonment. The South rebuilt its roads and its hierarchies in the same breath. Cities rose, but liberty did not rise with them. Unpaid labor became paid starvation. Chains became contracts. Slavery became something else in name only. And the North tolerated it, not enthusiastically, but effectively. America did not lose Reconstruction in battle. It lost it by neglect. And neglect can be more lethal than war, because war kills bodies. Neglect kills futures. The South learned this. The freed learned it faster. They built schools with their own hands. They purchased land few acres at a time. They voted when allowed. They prayed when forbidden. They raised children inside hatred and taught them to hope anyway. They survived without being promised safety. They lived without being granted dignity. And they carried memory like inheritance. For decades, the country told itself the war had been resolved. It had not. It had simply been sealed in silence. Statues went up, not to celebrate freedom, but to preserve defiance. Schools taught sanitized histories. Courts issued sanitized justice. Lines were drawn modern and invisible. And everything changed, except the wound. Reconstruction did not fail because the nation tried too hard. It failed because the nation gave up too early. And when a people give up on justice, injustice grows legs. The war ended in 1865. Reconstruction stumbled through years. Then America walked away from both, and the ghosts stayed behind. The Civil War never ended. It transformed. It moved into law, into education, into neighborhoods, into accents and assumptions. It moved where no cannon ever could, into the bloodstream. If you listen closely, the war still breathes. Not in gunshots, but in arguments. Not in uniforms, but in uniforms of color. Not in artillery, but in opportunity denied. What began as slavery became separation. What began as rebellion became resentment. What began as victory became unfinished. And that unfinished thing followed the nation into the centuries that came after. It followed into migration and protest, into music and mourning, into movements born from names written too early on gravestones. The new war would not be fought with muskets. It would be fought with memory, and memory, unlike war, never ends. Reconstruction did not close the book. It left it open, and every generation since has added a sentence, sometimes hopeful, sometimes unforgivable, but never empty, because the Civil War was not merely a conflict of states. It was a collision of souls, and souls do not surrender when papers are signed. They linger. They argue. They demand. The South lay in ruins. The North stood uncertain. The freed stood alone. And America, exhausted, victorious, and divided, walked into the future carrying the past like a scar it refused to name. And that scar still aches, not because the wound was deep, but because it was never fully healed. And broken nations, like broken people, always remember where it hurt most. Epilogue. The War That Made America. By the time the smoke finally thinned, America no longer recognized itself. The country that emerged from the Civil War looked the same on maps, but nowhere else. The rivers still ran. The mountains still stood. The oceans still whispered their endless song. But the meaning behind the flag had changed. The words in the Constitution had changed. The weight carried by the idea of America had changed. The war did not simply break the nation apart. It rebuilt it from its bones. Before the war, the United States had been something fragile, more agreement than country, a collection of states bound loosely by paper and compromise, held together by a hope that difference could coexist forever without consequence. Federal power was cautious. National identity was thin. Loyalty was local. A man often loved his state more than his country, his region more than his flag. Before the war, America was a union. After the war, it was a nation. The question of whether a state could leave had been answered, not by law, by blood. The Civil War decided that the United States was not a suggestion. It was a permanence. The war taught America that the federal government was no longer a guest in its own house. It could command armies. It could reshape economies. It could redefine citizenship. It could say what freedom meant and enforce it with force. The Constitution was no longer merely interpreted. It was wielded. From that moment forward, the national government would no longer be a distant referee between quarreling regions. It became the spine of the country. And with that power came something heavier than authority: responsibility. The war also altered the meaning of citizenship itself. Before the Civil War, a citizen was often defined by where he was born. After the war, citizenship became something deeper, something universal, something promised. The end of slavery did not merely remove chains. It redefined the soul of the American promise. A nation that once wrote human bondage into its laws was forced to erase its own handwriting. And in doing so, it wrote something new onto itself. Freedom was no longer regional. It was national. Slavery was not simply outlawed. It was declared incompatible with American existence. The country did not just defeat a rebellion. It confronted itself. And that confrontation left scars that never softened. The Civil War did not settle America gently into a better future. It forced the nation into it, pulled it, dragged it, sometimes kicking, sometimes screaming, and sometimes breaking. From the ashes of burned cities and shattered lives, a new America arrived. Not innocent, not ideal, but transformed. The idea of the United States was no longer a political arrangement. It became a conviction, and conviction is dangerous because it can save, but it can also divide. The war ended slavery on paper, but it began a struggle that would stretch into centuries, because freedom written into law is not the same as freedom lived in reality. Emancipation freed bodies. It did not instantly heal history. The chains were gone, the wounds remained. And those wounds whispered into laws and courts and classrooms. They moved from battlefield to ballot, from cannon smoke to policy, from blood to bureaucracy. Reconstruction tried to build a better future from shattered brick and shattered trust. Sometimes it succeeded. Often it failed. And where it failed, ghosts moved in. The Civil War had promised a rebirth. Reconstruction delivered a reckoning. The country wanted peace, but peace required honesty, and honesty is a war of its own. The war also left a psychological inheritance no generation escaped. It reshaped how Americans thought of themselves. Before the war, identity had rested lightly. After the war, it weighed more. Every family carried it, even the ones who had never fought. Every town bore its shadow, even the ones that never burned. The Civil War planted memory into the national bloodstream. It became something Americans did not just study. They inherited it. Names like Gettysburg, Antietam, and Appomattox did not fade into textbooks. They became moral locations. They became emotional geographies. Places where the soul of a country had been tested, and sometimes had failed. The war also gave America something rare and dangerous. A myth, not of perfection, but of survival. Out of catastrophe came a story of endurance. Out of fracture came identity. Out of defeat and victory alike came meaning. The Civil War gave America the belief that it could endure anything. And that belief would shape every war that followed, every crisis, every division, sometimes toward courage, sometimes toward arrogance. The war whispered a dangerous truth into the ears of the future. If we survive that, we can survive everything. And sometimes, that whisper becomes permission instead of wisdom. The Civil War also created the American soldier, not as a provincial fighter defending soil, but as a national figure, an embodiment of the Union itself. After the war, a man did not fight only for Virginia or Ohio. He fought for something called America. The battlefield taught the nation a new language of sacrifice, and it spoke it fluently from then on. The war taught Americans that their country could bleed and still live. It taught them that their ideals could fracture and still matter. It taught them that evil could exist within their borders and still be confronted. But it also taught them something darker, that victory does not erase pain, that peace does not guarantee unity, that ending a war does not end its consequences. The Civil War changed America, but it did not cure it. It did not make the nation better automatically. It made the nation capable of becoming better. And capability is not destiny. It is choice. Every generation since has lived in the shadow of that choice. The war did not end hatred. It forced it into disguise. It did not eliminate injustice. It made it quieter. It did not complete the American experiment. It saved it from destruction. And survival is not the same as success. The Civil War remains the great paradox of American history. It destroyed the country to save it. It killed hundreds of thousands so that millions could claim freedom. It broke families so that a nation could exist. It solved the question of unity through the violence of disunity. And from that contradiction, America was reborn. But rebirth is not a moment. It is a process, and America is still in it. Every argument over rights, every debate over identity, every struggle over power, every unresolved injustice, they are not echoes of the Civil War. They are its continuation. Different weapons, same fault lines, different language, same wound. The war did not make America perfect. It made America possible. It is the reason the country has the shape it does. The reason the federal government holds authority. The reason freedom is not negotiable. The reason citizenship is not optional. The reason the flag is more than fabric. The war took away the illusion that America could exist unchanged forever, and replaced it with something more difficult: the obligation to change. The Civil War was not merely fought with guns. It was fought over meaning, over whether a republic could survive itself, over whether freedom applied to everyone, over whether a nation could hold contradictions without being torn apart. The war answered those questions not with philosophy, but with graves. And from those graves, the future grew. Uneven, imperfect, unfinished. America after the war was not innocent, but it was alive, wounded, but breathing, scarred, but standing. The war did not deliver paradise. It delivered possibility. And possibility is heavier than destiny, because it demands responsibility. Every generation since the Civil War has been handed a question disguised as inheritance. What will you do with what they paid for? Not what will you celebrate. Not what will you forget. But what will you build? Out of sacrifice, out of suffering, out of blood and ideals and broken compromises. The Civil War made America, not as a symbol, but as an obligation. And the war has never truly ended, because the war was not just for territory. It was for the meaning of the country itself. And meaning is never finished. It is argued, it is carried, it is challenged by time. The Civil War still breathes, not in cannons, but in conscience, not in battalions, but in ballots, not in forts, but in futures. The war that made America did not forge a finished nation. It forged one that would never be allowed to stop becoming. And in that becoming, the country remains. Unsettled, unsatisfied, alive. America was born in revolution, but it was remade in civil war, and it still carries the weight of both in its heart.